You know, these things that we maybe, as you said, during childhood, we don't even notice to be an issue, but they create something called our core beliefs. And so when these events happen over and over and over, we start to develop a belief about ourselves, about others, and about the world as a whole.
We are in for such a treat today. Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick is going to join us, and we're going to talk walls versus boundaries. We're going to talk about relational programming. We're going to talk about the fact that anger comes from anxiety, how to call each other out. What does good enough parenting mean? You are in for a treat. First, a couple of quick messages, and then we'll get right to learn from people who lived it. Here's a question for you. Are you a transitional character in your lineage? It's one of my favorite things to ask people these days as a motivational speaker. And I would love an opportunity to come into your business, your nonprofit, your corporation, your church, your schools. And if you've got a group of people that could really benefit from the value of a self-care strategy so they show up better for you, let's do this thing. Rates depend on the size of your group, and we can connect at learnfrompeoplewholiveit.com. My 75-minute workshop is engaging, it's interactive, it's real, it's authentic, and most importantly, as I said a moment ago, your folks will leave with a self-care strategy that will have them showing up as the best versions of themselves for you. LearnFromPeopleWhoLivedIt.com. Click on the speaking tab. Hi there, it's Matthew Blades, and I want to tell you about my friends at Herbie Design because we've been using them for more than 10 years for our hockey programs. But Herbie Design does team apparel faster and less expensive than most. They do embroidery, laser etching, custom awards, and really anything else you need to make your brand amazing. And I've used them to make all of my Learn From People Who Lived It thank you gifts and to create custom sweatshirts for our team moms and dads. But like I said, they're capable of so much more, and they can get it done faster and for less money than the others. Visit Herbie Design online at herbiedesign.com, and remember, they work with charter schools, dance schools, hockey programs, small businesses, large law firms, volleyball clubs, booster clubs. They can certainly work with you. When you get on the phone with Jim, let him know Matthew Blades from Learn From People Who Lived It sent you. You'll find him online at herbiedesign.com. That's HERBIE design.com.
Looking for no bullshit conversation about mental health? Find Learn From People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn From People Who Lived It.
Welcome to another episode of Learn From People Who Lived It.
Well, welcome to another episode of Learn From People Who Lived It. I'm Matthew. You can see right there on my right, she is relatable. She is Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick. You know, I had to work on that. I had to slow that down a little bit because you probably get this a lot. People want to say Frederick, don't they?
They want to say it, they want to spell it, they want to do all the things. So I've been correcting it multiple times a day.
Do you go by Dr. Elizabeth, Dr. Fedrick? Do you go by Liz? How can I address you?
I go by Liz. I keep it relatable, so I am just Liz.
Fair enough. My sister is Sarah Elizabeth, and so I always, of course, always love that name, Elizabeth. So there you go, Liz.
Very good.
Listen, you've got a lot going on, and allow me to introduce you to my audience. And then just so everybody knows, we're going to have this incredible discussion today on walls versus boundaries. It's one of the things that I'm so incredibly passionate about when I go out and I speak to groups about self-care plans, and that being a vital ingredient to taking care of yourself is to understand the difference between the wall and the boundary. And I think Liz is going to help us get there today. On your website, I love what it says. It says sometimes life is just hard, whether it's situational, relational, behavioral, or emotional. At times it can just be stressful and overwhelming. And my goal is to help you sort through the chaos and provide you the tools and the resources needed to create those long-lasting changes. So you work in all kinds of areas you're familiar with, depression, anxiety, relationships, grief, loss, transitions. You've kind of seen it all. How long have you had the DR in front of your name?
The DR's only been around for about 4 or 5 years. I've been practicing, though, mental health with my master's for just over 10. So I have seen it all. I started working with children and adolescents, and I have just evolved my practice from there and mostly work now relationship-based and adults, families, couples, things like that.
Evolve is appropriately name dropped there. Evolve Counseling AZ is where you can find her online. There are 3 locations, soon to be one in Ahwatukee, which is my hood. So that's going to be kind of cool. When do you expect that to be open?
I'm hoping May of this year. Construction should be done and we should be good to go.
All right. Well, listen, I don't want anybody to think that Liz and I are best friends that go way back 100 years. In fact, just a few weeks ago, somebody that I follow shared this post right here. I'm going to put this up on the screen for those of you that are watching. And this idea behind walls versus boundaries, like I said a few minutes ago, when I go out and I deliver my motivational speaking, I spend a few minutes talking about walls versus boundaries, and I put it pretty simply. It's like, the problem with the wall is none of the good people can get through either. And so the boundaries, they take a little bit of time. They take some understanding. They take maybe some cognitive therapy tools to get your head around how it's going to look, taste, touch, and feel. But ask anybody who's got healthy boundaries how they feel about their life, and I'm betting they like their life. I'm betting that they like the way that they have chosen to live with that kind of intention. And so what about walls versus boundaries, Liz, gets you excited? And why do you feel like that's such an important thing to put up on your Instagram account?
Yeah, the boundaries in general, like you're saying, are such an important topic, and it can be really hard for people to grasp. And this idea that there are really three types of boundaries. So there are our porous boundaries. This is where you don't really have boundaries at all. We can't even really call them boundaries. It's more maybe a mere suggestion of how you would like to be treated, or no suggestion at all. And then we go into rigid boundaries, which is this other end of the spectrum. And this is the walls. And these are, it really goes beyond a boundary. It is dictator. This is black and white. There is no room for change or flexibility. And then in the middle are healthy boundaries. And this is really the concept of boundaries. And healthy boundaries should be firm, but flexible. So they're clear, they're fully stated. This is how you can treat me. This is what you can say to me. This is what you can do around me. But there's flexibility to it, because the fact is we are ever changing individuals. And so that flexibility is crucial. And the reason it's so important to me is personally, I tend to sometimes fall into the wall side. And so it's a good reminder for me that boundaries don't have to be walls.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. It's my understanding over the last couple of years, as I've been really doing a deep dive into my own mental health and wellness, that a lot of these, I call it an operating system, a lot of the way that we operate stems from our childhood. And we were all, even if you had the world's greatest childhood and it was just lollipops and playgrounds, no doubt you had some conflict, you had some trauma, you had some things show up for you that helped create the person that we have in front of us today. And so when you're a kid, though, you have no idea that that's taking place. You have no idea that the way mom or dad is treating you is going to have this, long lasting impact. And as much as we'd all like to believe that we have our shit together in our 30s and 40s, like, most of us are still figuring it out. Most of us are still trying to get it straightened out. And so I think that's where we have to start, Liz. We have to talk about why you even felt the need for the wall in the first place. And it's usually as a result of either your upbringing or some situation that happened to you. Maybe they're one and the same. Give me your thoughts and opinions on that, if you would.
Absolutely. And you said it so well. Our childhood creates what I call our relational programming. And so the way that we interact today in relationships, which is where boundaries come in, is the result of these interactions we had with our primary caregivers throughout upbringing. And it's really these consistent interactions. They can sometimes be covert. And often, as you're describing, people can have wonderful childhoods, but it's ultimately imperfect people raising imperfect people. So there will be glitches along the way, regardless of how hard your parent is trying. And so sometimes these maybe concerns or these ruptures are more covert in nature. And so that can be maybe subtle messages that are sent by a caregiver, maybe a caregiver who works a lot of hours, these things that we maybe, as you said, during childhood, we don't even notice to be an issue, but they create something called our core beliefs. And so when these events happen over and over and over, we start to develop a belief about ourselves, about others, and about the world as a whole. And we develop these traits, our adaptive child traits, that help us to stay safe in that environment. And so sometimes it is these really rigid boundaries. If maybe we had caregivers who weren't very boundaried, or they were enmeshed. They were often just too much in our business, too close, didn't allow us to make our own decisions. We develop different characteristics to keep ourselves safe from that. The issue is that then into adulthood, these behaviors that once were adaptive in nature, they once were developed to keep us safe, become maladaptive. And so now these rigid boundaries that we would put into place at one point to protect us from enmeshment, like you said at the very beginning, are now not only keeping us safe from that, which they are, but they're also keeping us protected, which it's not actually protected, it's just really guarded from the good stuff as well. And so, to really summarize, yes, that relational programming of all of these interactions throughout the lifespan that are often reinforced into adulthood really set the stage for how we then interact and behave in our adult relationships.
So I'll give our audience a couple of examples, and if you want to be open and vulnerable, please, this is the show to do it. But when I tell folks all the time, so when I go speak, Liz, you don't know this about me, but when I go speak, I talk to people about my trauma trilogy. It's what I call it now. It's like those 3 events that happened to me along the way that really impacted and changed who I am. And one of the first ones was that when I was 6 years old, I discovered my dad's entire adult magazine collection. And I totally became a fan. Like, I liked it, right? It was one of those things where I was 6 and looking at this stuff, 7 looking at this stuff, 8 looking at this stuff. And I had no idea, boy, I'm really laying it out on the line here. I had no idea how that was going to impact me later in life. But there were many relationships where I struggled with intimacy. And it's really because of what you're talking about, this relational programming. When the wires are getting connected at 6 and 7 and 8 for that kind of stuff, there's no way that doesn't have an impact later in life when the real thing starts to show up. Would you agree with that?
I 100% agree.
Yeah. And I don't, and maybe even go into that a little bit about why that's the case.
Yeah. So during those really formative, when our brain is going through development, and the way the brain fires is the way that it wires. And so all of these interactions that we're having and then having repeatedly, so even that you're describing happening at 6, 7, 8, so it starts to make these experiences truly part of your neurological makeup. And those significant experiences then will influence, so what you're talking about specifically with the adult magazines, that's going to influence desensitization to those images later on. That's going to also influence even your concept of intimacy. So what does that mean to be intimate with somebody? And so you're right, these multiple situations that take place that often at the time we have no clue. My personal experience of that was that I was my mom's emotional caretaker since one of my earliest memories is sitting on the couch consoling her after a fight with my father. And that was my role in her life up until about a year ago, when I had to remove myself completely from that because it was so greatly influencing, the way that I showed up as an adult. And so that was part of my relational programming. And when I'm talking about how I usually lean more into walls, that is why I do, because those codependent behaviors were so severe in childhood that I swung to what we call counterdependency. And I just started to push everyone away because I was tired of caretaking.
Gosh, it makes so much sense to me. And look at you, you're still helping people. You're still taking care of people. It's probably not a mistake, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do believe that is why I really thrive at what I do with my clients, but that is also, there's boundaries built in. And so that's also not coincidental that I chose a career where there's a boundary built in that I can't have a relationship beyond that professional relationship. But with my personal relationships, I most certainly struggle when I feel like somebody wants too much from me, somebody's over texting me, all of those things where I'm like, whoo, pump the brakes.
Interesting. But that's so important to say, because I have this line that I deliver all the time, which is, you hear people say this about adults all the time. You're acting like a child. You're acting like a child. And you are literally acting out those inner child wounds, as I have come to understand this. And like you said, that's your relational programming. That's how you're wired. That's how you're firing. And you really can't do much to change that until you acknowledge it. And so maybe let's spend a couple of minutes talking about that. Maybe the light bulb has gone on for somebody in just this quick 10 minutes that we've been talking, and they're going, oh my God, I treat my husband that way because of something from my past, or vice versa. So let's first start talking about awareness and that idea that you're going to start to figure out that this is a truth for you.
Yes. So what I generally suggest people do, and I do this with my clients within the first couple sessions, is creating a timeline. And you can do this on your own. You don't need to do it with a professional. It's helpful because they'll help you to become maybe aware of some themes that your blind spots will prevent you from seeing. But really, you're creating a timeline from birth. Now, it's crucial that you start at birth. And of course, what do you remember about birth? You don't. But you've been told stories. Most people have a narrative around who was living in the home, what were their careers, what was the dynamic like. A lot of us have that narrative. And then if you take that and you move forward throughout your lifespan, and what you're really doing is you're tracking themes that took place. You're tracking themes of abandonment, of rejection, of times you didn't feel good enough, being bullied. And it doesn't just have to be with your parents. It could be with siblings, teachers, peers. And when you look back on all of those significant events, really making sense of like, okay, that repeated. Okay, yeah, that makes sense why this feels triggering to me as adulthood. And that self-awareness, which completely to your point, is key. Because without that awareness, we don't know why am I being triggered and what does it mean? And something that I'm a big like stars align and manifestation, I'm all of those things. And I've been talking a lot about this week. So it's great that it's coming up. When we get angry and we lash out in a way that is, I will say it to my clients, I'll lash out in a way that I would be embarrassed for a client to see that I got that upset. And we peel back that anger, there's often some irritability, some discomfort under that. And when we peel it back another layer, there's anxiety. And there's a sense of maybe even fear, of worry, of hurt. And when we peel that back another layer, it is almost always the unmet needs of your inner child that are sitting there just completely raw and exposed. And so even with the story that you're describing, the unmet needs of your inner child at 6, 7, 8 was protection. There was a lack of protection that took place, which left you vulnerable and left you exposed to these situations, which then later impacted you. And so I noticed that for me, while mine is the counterdependency and all of that, mine is also not getting quality time, that I grew up with a lot of emotional neglect. And so when I am in a relationship and I feel that my emotional needs are being neglected, I become angry. And when we peel that back, that's exactly what's going on.
That's so interesting. And I just love this talk so much. I knew I was going to, but I had somebody say one time that my anxiety shows itself through anger. And that resonated so hard with me. And I thought, my God, that's what's happening with so many people. Yeah. They're so anxious about all these things that they're just pissed off all the time. And so, am I hearing you right? Am I getting this right? Anger might be your first indicator that there's something going on that you need to peel back?
Yeah, and that's actually, I love that you bring that up, because that is one of the things about our mood states, our daily functioning, that people do not realize. Anger is actually a manifestation of anxiety. So all anger comes from anxiety. And the reason why, and I'll try to keep it brief, but the reason that that's happening is our biological response to anxiety. So when our amygdala, which is the emotional center of our brain, when it senses a perceived threat, it sends out all the biochemicals that we need in order to stay safe. So that's our fight and flight. And so if you think about that anxiety brings about the fight or flight response because our brain is like, yo, you need to find a way to stay safe. Well, what is fight and flight? That's enough adrenaline that it comes out as anger. I mean, that is fight. And so that's exactly when people come in and they're like, I'm struggling with anger, I have anger issues. No, my friend, you have anxiety issues. And that's where we've got to start.
Okay, let's give another example that's fairly common, and I talk about this a lot on my podcast. I grew up in a home where my mom was the disciplinarian, and she lacked some tools there to do things the right way, mostly because that's exactly how she was parented. And like I tell everybody, my mom's amazing. She's loving, she's kind, she's sweet. We just had all the other crap too.
Yeah.
And so when I'm an adult in my life, and it's like you grow up with the person who tells you they love you is also the person beating your ass. And so now you're going to get into relationships, be it career or personal, where you're going to have this, like, you're going to tolerate shit you shouldn't because of that relational programming. Talk a little bit about that.
And that's exactly what happens. So these interactions, they create that framework for what we come to expect out of our adult relationships, what we think is normal, what we think is acceptable, and what we even seek out. Our brain is designed to seek out things that are familiar. And so what you're describing, and which I think is the case for a lot of people, is that the very person who is there to keep them safe, to protect them, to love them, is also the person inflicting physical and emotional pain on them. And so the brain becomes... And punishment, let me rephrase that. Consequences, discipline, that is all necessary from a caregiver. That also can be administered with love and with nurture. That doesn't have to be aggressive. That doesn't have to be scary. And so when this person who is simultaneously, inflicting that type of pain on us, but then they're the one who kisses us and tucks us in before bed, the brain becomes really accustomed to thinking that love means chaos. And love means this person can hurt me, and that's okay, because as long as they love me later in the day, that's okay. That's healthy. That's normal.
Gosh, I just hope the light bulbs are freaking out on people right now. It's like you hear all these folks talk about it. Why do I keep meeting the same guys? Why do I keep dating the same girls? Why do I keep getting into the same relationships? Why do I keep getting the same kind of boss that shows up in my life? And literally, it's like you get what you're willing to take. And and if you don't know any different or any better, then you'll probably just keep doing the same thing, which is why I think that this is single-handedly almost one of the most important conversations that we can be having surrounding mental health. Is until you work on your stuff, we all have to deal with your stuff. And I want people to understand the power of being on the other side. And I'm sure you see it all the time, Liz. That is a terrifying thing to do, to acknowledge, number one, that you might not like somebody who's close to you, or you might be angry at them. That's a hard space for people to be, especially if it's a mom, dad, brother, sister, husband, wife, right?
Yeah, for a lot of people, that equates to betrayal. So that's a really hard thing to even admit, is that we have resentments towards somebody, because you have to also think about the messages that are sent. I put a roof over your head. I gave you food. I took good care of you. And we're told that message over and over. There's a really interesting book by Jonice Webb. I believe it is Jonice Weber, maybe, Running on Empty. And she talks a lot about the toll of emotional neglect and these different things that we're talking about. That a lot of the research is indicating it's less about what happened to us in childhood, and I shouldn't say it's less, but I guess in addition to also what didn't happen. So a lot of previous research was focused more on these overt abuse, overt neglect, without realizing that also the good things that didn't happen, which we see take place in emotional neglect situations, also lead to these unprocessed trauma behaviors in adulthood. And so, as you're saying, for the people that are listening, yes, you might have had a roof over your head, and you might have had food to eat and clothes on your back and all of those things. And you maybe didn't have anyone to hold you when you fell and skinned your knee. You maybe didn't have anyone to help you with your homework. You didn't have anyone to tell you you're going to be okay. And that is painful, and that takes a toll on you.
And isn't it also important to note, because I do a little work with this love and logic, and I love the philosophy and the parenting philosophy surrounding it. And the one thing they're clear to say is, like, listen, It's impossible. There's no caregiver or parent in the world is going to meet every single need of every single child. Like, it's just impossible. We're going to slip. We're going to mess up. You and I are both parents. We fucking made mistakes. I mean, you know, we've done things we wish we hadn't done. But I think it's neat that you're doing work with a lot of children, because that's the level in which we can maybe get to these guys early, hear them, see them, give them better tools than we all had growing up so that they can process this information in a different way. Do you think that this mental health, mental wellness movement that's bubbling up right now in the most beautiful way, do you believe that we're going to have a different generation of people in the years to come?
I sure think so. I don't see how we couldn't. We're going to have a lot more self-aware people, if nothing else. I would definitely say that. And yes, with the children and the adolescents we're doing work with, and that's originally what I did start working with, like I told you before we started recording, that was the population and it was exactly because of that I wanted to get in and be able to help break the cycle. However, as my career grew, I started to realize that my passion was to work with the parents, because I was with their child for maybe an hour a week, an hour every other week. But if I could instill these parenting skills into parents to help that their interactions the other 6 days a week, that they were able to meet their child's emotional needs, that is where I really saw such a profound impact. And as you're saying, parenting is you will never be perfect. So if you try to be perfect, those expectations in and of themselves will screw you up. But there is such thing as good enough parenting. And that means that we're showing up consistently and we're meeting a majority of the needs. And then also keeping in mind that it is not about the rupture, it's about the repair. So there's a very good chance you're going to rupture multiple times a week with your child. You are human, that's inevitable. But how are you handling that after? Are you going to seek out your child and letting them know, hey, the way I talked to you is not okay. I'm really sorry for that. Let's talk through this. That is the repair, and that's what makes the difference.
Let's segue in a little bit about this boundaries and walls in a moment. But first, let me ask you let me get your thoughts on this. Okay, so I'm listening to this podcast. I realize that I'm not a perfect parent. That's the first time that light bulb's gone on for me. And now I feel bad. Now I feel so bad. And I don't even know what to do anymore. And the problem, as far as I can tell, is if you allow yourself to feel crappy, you'll probably treat people crappy. And so you may end up doing more damage or something like that. Or one of the other things that I've noticed in just myself is you get so afraid of doing it again that you do the opposite, which is you completely pull back. And you're so afraid. You're so, like, there's times where I get so afraid to engage because I'm afraid of my anger or what might come through or what might come up or something like that. And so what advice might you offer parents who are listening to this right now, who made some mistakes, they feel bad about it, and now they're ready to do something different?
Do something different. That's my advice to you. That is exactly, you have this awareness, and that awareness is key. I would say find a therapist, do some reading. Brene Brown has a really awesome Audible, Gifts of Imperfect Parenting. It's just a couple-hour talk that she does on this very concept that we are all going to screw up. And I'm glad that you're saying that, because not for 1 minute do I want to send the message that the expectation is to be perfect, because I'll tell you what, I fucked that up a long time ago. I will never be perfect as a partner, as a therapist, as a mom. I will never be. And I don't try to be, because that expectation is what leads to the anger when we're constantly disappointing ourselves. But when we can have realistic expectations that I am going to mess up, but the most important thing is that I'm willing to take ownership and accountability when I do, that's the game changer. So with people listening right now and having this awareness of, okay, I've messed up, first and foremost, we all have. So I see you, I feel you, I hear you. And secondly, change is possible, but you have to put in the effort to change.
What about this dynamic where one parent wants to change and the other thinks it's okay? You probably run into that a lot, right? Where parents aren't on the same page. And so that becomes pretty challenging, right? It's no different than the weight loss journey where somebody's ready to lose 20 pounds and the other guy, still wants to eat nachos all the time. How do you navigate that?
Lots of open conversation, lots of open dialogue, and the willingness to acknowledge what's outside of your control. So if you are the parent who wants to, or who doesn't, but if you're the parent who wants to change and your partner's not willing to get on board, you can only control you. You have no control over what your partner says or does, but you do get to influence how you interact with your child when those situations arise. And so that's the most important thing, is staying focused on what you do have control over.
Such great advice. All right, let's jump into this post. It's so awesome. Walls versus boundaries. We all feel this need to be, safe, secure, and respected. I don't think there's anybody watching who would argue with that. You, at the end of the day, that's what you're looking for, to feel safe, secure, and respected. And so when you talk about walls, the first thing you list there is avoiding intimacy and vulnerability at all costs. What does that look like in a relationship with a spouse? What does that look like in a relationship with a child?
So that's avoiding deep conversation. That's avoiding anything that goes beyond surface level conversation. That's even avoiding intellectual conversations, political, spiritual, anything where you have to give an opinion or hear someone's opinion. It also involves oftentimes physical touch. And so that is, I sit with couples all the time where one partner really does not like physical touch, and that creates conflict. We also see that can be impact children. And so if a parent is somebody who avoids intimacy and that type of touch makes them uncomfortable, we see that they do the same behavior with the child. So they only touch them if it's required, which goes back to the emotional neglect piece.
All right. So up next on this one is being rigid with expectations of others. And you kind of just alluded to that. Whoops, sorry. It's that idea of I can't even be around others that have a different opinion than me because I'm just going to lose my biscuits. Yeah. Go ahead.
And it goes beyond that, because it's even the expectations of how you do the dishes and how you talk to me, how you dress, and again, both can be impacted with both your partner and a child, but these expectations and it leads to really overcritical behaviors, which is often a sign of a fear of intimacy.
When you're talking about walls versus boundaries, just so I know, do you like to kind of go back and forth, or do you feel it's beneficial to talk about what it looks like to have walls and then have conversations about boundaries?
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Okay, so let's just hit a couple of more. We don't need to hit all of them, but you all make sure you're following her, and we'll have links in our show notes to connect her Instagram page, which is just filled with all kinds of goodness like this. But what about isolating when you're upset? Let's talk about that one.
So that's a common behavior that takes place with individuals with avoidant attachment style. And that's essentially what walls is avoidant attachment. For people listening, attachment styles: anxious, avoidant, disorganized, and then secure. I won't go into all of that, but those attachment styles do matter because they tie into your relational programming. And when somebody is more avoidant or they have the walls, when they get upset, let's go back to what I was talking about earlier with you experience the anger, and then it goes down to the irritability, the anxiety, and then your inner child. As a child, you learned that the only way to stay safe was to remove yourself from that situation. Maybe it was an alcoholic parent, maybe it was a physically abusive parent. Whatever it was, you learned that by just completely removing yourself altogether was how you felt the safest. And so in adulthood, you do the same. You withdraw, you isolate, you hide out by yourself until you start to feel better.
So, okay, well, let's do one more and then I've got a question. Designed to maintain control and keep people away. I love this because part of one of the biggest pieces of my healing journey is that idea of letting go. Stop trying to control this thing. Like you said a few minutes ago, I have no power how my wife is going to react in this situation. I have no power how you're going to react if I ask you a crazy question. And so just let go of this idea of control. Let's talk about that, and then I have a follow-up for you.
And that's exactly what it is. So circle of control is a term that I use in every session, probably multiple times a session. And the idea is that everything in the middle of that circle we have influence over. These are our own choices, our own behaviors. And everything outside of it, which is 99% of things, you have no control over. And when somebody has walls, it's because they often feel that things are so out of control around them that it's the way that they keep control. They're trying to keep control. And so that is often where they believe the benefit of it comes in, is because I feel so out of control in my life that if I just keep everyone away and at arm's length, which again, I can completely relate to, then I get to keep me safe. And that's the idea behind it.
So what the question that I wanted to follow up with you was, how the human nature, it tends to want to call people out on their shit. And maybe you're somebody who's got a spouse who likes to be, like we said on this list, likes to be really controlling or isolates when they're upset. What's a good way to bring that up and announce that it's bothering you if you're in a relationship, both with your, in a marriage or long term, and then your children too? I think we got to talk about that as well.
So when we're talking about a partner, the best way to bring it up is not while it's happening, first and foremost. So you want to make sure that there's a calm, appropriate time. This is not after a stressful day of work. This is not when you're trying to hurry and get to an event. This is at an appropriate time where a conversation can take place. You also want to ask your partner, is this a good time to talk, and really lay the groundwork, and then using I statements. I feel abandoned when you isolate after a fight. And that really sets the stage that you're taking ownership for what is within your circle of control. And this is how I feel about it. And I want you to know that. And then what is the solution? How can we come up with a compromise?
Okay. I like that answer quite a bit. There's a way to set the stage. What if you're dealing with somebody who just does not want to move or does not want to change? And let me give you a little context for this question. It's my belief that your environment sometimes has to change. People have to come, people have to go. Some people are chapters, some people are one page in your book. Some people show up in chapter 1, 7, and at the end of the book, and you got to be okay with that. So how do you go about being with somebody who's not going to change? And we've all heard that expression before. He's never going to change. She's never going to change.
And so here's the thing. It boils down to your circle of control, and it boils down to your acceptance or change. And so what that means is that when I run into this conversation all of the time, when you're with a partner who refuses to change, they refuse to parent in a way that you know is good for the child, they refuse to meet your emotional needs, they refuse to stop drinking, the list goes on and on. You have the power to decide, I either love that person because of all these other reasons, and so I'm accepting this behavior because I have zero control over it. Or I'm choosing change, and that means, as you're saying, I'm changing my environment, I'm changing the way I'm handling it, I'm changing the way I set boundaries around it. And the reality is that acceptance and change can take place. We can accept that there's things that we don't like and work to change. But I really, for this particular situation, I make it black or white, because people want to come and tell me over and over, but they just won't do it. They just won't do it. And at some point, you have to recognize what is within your circle, and getting them to just do it is not. And so you get to decide, okay, that's who they are and I accept it, or I can't accept this and I have to make a change.
I would like to offer up a tool that I've used along the way. And I'll just give for example, I used to have a boss who was really, really just mean. And it really bothered me. It was one of those situations where it produced a super high level of anxiety. I didn't even want to go talk to this person. I didn't want to be around them. I sure as hell didn't want to be in a meeting or have to go into their office with them. And then one day I had a heart change, and I started to see this person as the really, really hurt individual that they were. And I started to truly see the pain that they must wake up with every single day to act this way towards other people. Did that person ever change? No. But by me changing my attitude and outlook about them, the relationship changed. It became a little easier. I didn't get so anxious every time I had to be around them, because I guess in my own way, before even knowing it, I had set up some new rules in my head around what I was going to take and what I wasn't going to take. I love that as a tool. What else? What other kind of tools might you suggest?
Well, and I just want to, address that real quick, because that really becomes powerful even with partners, because what we notice is that a partner's trigger and the reaction to that trigger inevitably is going to trigger the partner, and then their reaction, you know what I mean? It becomes this ping pong match. And so that's exactly it. When you can identify, okay, they do make me mad when they don't tell me they're going to be late from work. And so I get reactive to that. But my change in this situation could be, instead of getting reactive, I could do X, Y, and Z instead. Well, then that might influence the situation over here. And so I love that you're bringing that up, that our change does not always have to be leaving. Sometimes it's just handling the situation differently, and that can make a big difference. Some other tools, though, I mean, truly go to therapy, read some books, listen to podcasts like this, get the knowledge that you need to really understand what's going on, so that you can make more informed decisions when you're addressing these really hard situations.
That's great advice. That's great advice. All right, with our last 10 minutes or so together, let's talk about boundaries. It's one thing that we all need to do a little bit better job of, myself included. So number one on your list is clearly defined expectations around how others can treat you. What does that mean? I mean, I know what it means, but I want you to break that down a little.
Yes. So by no means am I suggesting that you make a Bible of all the different things of every part of your life that you're going to present to people. Right. But if there are situations that come up, so let's use the late from work example. A boundary around that would be, if you're going to be late, I need you to please let me know. And that can get a little wonky, because you're asking for something rather telling them they can't do something, and they can choose whatever they want to do. But that would be an example of that, is that, can you please text me if you're going to be late? Or if, let's say, after a long day of work, maybe your partner is constantly wanting to come hug you and smother you with physical touch. And maybe that's really overwhelming when you're stressed out. Hey, when I get home from work, I just need about 20 minutes, and then I'll let you know when I'm ready for physical touch. That would be a very clear boundary, where you're giving some type of time frame. We're keeping it firm but flexible, but you're letting them know specifically what you're okay with.
Love that. Flexibility when expectations, or with expectations when appropriate. Let's shake that up, because that seems to be our whole world right now. We're absolutely moving into a space where post-COVID, we're learning to live with each other again in a lot of ways. And in a lot of ways, I think we've all seen examples of people have forgotten what it's like to be around others. And so this idea of flexibility with expectations when appropriate, I like this. So tell me what you mean by that.
So with the example I just gave, even about the physical touch, that might mean we're not going to set a timer for 20 minutes every day when we get home. That might mean that there's some days where maybe they had a really hard day, and maybe they need you before the 20 minutes is up. Okay. So maybe they're melting down about something. Okay, we're going to take that into consideration. We're not going to say, nope, the 20 minutes is still, no, you have a need, and I can be flexible in this moment to meet that need. And so that's where the flexibility comes in, that we have these expectations that are generally the rule, but we're willing to take in the context. We're willing to see things beyond ourselves and be flexible when appropriate. But it's when appropriate, because when it becomes violation of self, that would not be considered appropriate. And this, let me just put this disclaimer as well. This is all very gray. This is all very nuanced. This is all very specific to each individual. So even as you are hearing me talk, if something doesn't feel true to you, doesn't feel right to you, if something activates your nervous system, then you might do it a little bit differently. But this is just the general rule book of how we can set these boundaries.
Gosh. All right, here we go. Expressing how it is or is not okay to touch or be near you. Intimacy is a really tricky thing for a lot of people, specifically as I've come to understand it over the last year of interviewing countless people who have experienced sexual trauma along the way. Touch can end up being one of the most difficult things in their relationship. So I don't know if we want to speak specifically to folks who have had to endure that level of abuse, but let's say you have, and now you're struggling with this boundary of what people can do to each other. And listen, like this can happen in marriages where a husband or a wife wants to do something that the other just does not want to do, isn't comfortable with. So, yeah, I mean, what does your smart brain say about that?
Well, I did a whole post about that today. So anyone who wants to dig deeper into that, go check out that post. I provide ideas on how to start conversations around sex. And then also I provide actual conversation starters. But yes, with a lot of my clients, a lot of my couple clients I sit with, this is very common. People have different preferences. They have different fantasies and desires, and what turns them on and arouses them is going to look different. And there has to be open conversation. That is the only way to remedy any of the discrepancies around intimacy, is to talk openly and honestly about it. And as you're describing, for the people who have had their space violated, knowing what boundaries you're comfortable with, and then the partner has to be willing to respect it. That is the only way that you build trust with somebody, is by giving them an evidence log to support that you are safe and trustworthy. And so that's a big part of the boundaries as well, is providing evidence log that you're willing to respect the boundaries.
Okay. Maybe one or two more of these things, and then we'll kind of wrap up. Taking a temporary time out when you're upset, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Saying no when something doesn't feel right. Boy, that is such a tricky word, because if you've had inner child wounds, and I just know this because of the work that I've done this last year, and you can probably speak more to it, but one of the quintessential attitudes of somebody who's been wounded as an inner child is being a people pleaser. Mm-hmm. And wanting to say yes and do the right thing and put themselves last, quite frankly, in almost every scenario, in an effort to make the people around them happy, more comfortable, whatever that is. So how do we navigate no a little easier?
Yeah, what you're describing would fall into the category of codependency. People cringe when they hear that word. I feel you on that. Really do some research into it, though. If anyone can relate to what you're saying about the people pleasing, the perfectionism, the chameleon behaviors, so we adapt to whoever's in the room to make them more comfortable. All of that goes back to our adaptive child. We had to have those behaviors to stay safe in childhood. And so all of those things are coming from somewhere. It's not because we're weak or defective. It's because it's how we learned how to stay safe. Mm-hmm. The thing to remember is that you're an adult now. Those things that you had to do at one point to stay safe no longer exist. You're allowed to say no, and you will be okay. And it's also important to remember that as humans, we are designed for adaptation. So saying no feels uncomfortable. The more we do it, the more we practice it, the more comfortable we become.
Right. And I love what Tony Robbins says, too. I don't know if you've ever looked into any of his stuff, but Tony's big about, like, hey, you don't just get to take all the crappy stuff or get mad at all the crappy stuff your parents gave you. Like, this stuff turned you out in some certain way, too, which has made you, incredible. Like, growing up in the childhood that I did, that completely allowed me to have the radio career that I had. I was amazing at walking into a room, reading it, knowing what needed to be done. I could see the look on people's faces and know, okay, that person needs something, this person needs something, that person wants to be alone. And so it's not all awful, but it definitely does impact you, and it's just good to understand where it's coming from. All right, this last one, designed to maintain safety in your relationships. I don't think that we often, at least me, I'll say, I don't know if I ever really think about the word safety, because, it feels safe. Nobody's hitting each other, nobody's yelling at each other. But there are times where you can feel unsafe, and it has nothing to do with violence of that nature, right?
Yeah, and let's talk about what it feels like to be safe or unsafe, because our really busy, fast-paced culture, often we don't even realize the physiological cues that our body is sending us, those biochemicals, alerting us to something being off or something not being right. And so the idea of feeling safe is not just about our physical safety. We have to stop making that the main focus. It's also about our emotional safety, our intellectual safety, our spiritual safety. And so when we have these interactions with people, when we pay more attention to our body, so does our stomach get tight? Does our chest, get tight? Do we get a lump in our throat? What are some of these feelings that we get in these situations? Because that is actually a lack of safety. And I recommend my clients do something called the 3 W's. I developed it years ago, and it's really an effective tool. And the first W is what's going on. So it's being more aware of what's going on in your body. What are those physiological cues? You have to slow down in order to catch that, because otherwise you just will move right through it. The second W is where's it coming from? Did something happen earlier in the day? Am I anticipating something happening later? Is something happening in the moment? And then the third W is what do I need? And that is how do I regulate? How do I calm down? How do I let my anxiety know, hey, I got you. You're safe. You're okay. And that could be taking the time out, taking some deep breaths, calling a friend. But those 3 W's really help us to be aware of in our environments, how often we're getting triggered and don't feel safe, and then allow us to also regulate when needed.
So I'm in my retreat about almost 2 years ago now, Liz, and literally the tool that this woman handed me was to put my hand over my heart, close my eyes, and just simply keep repeating, what do I need? What do I need?
Yes.
What do I need? What do I need? And it's amazing. When I use that tool, the answer never doesn't come. It always shows up for me. I don't always love it. I don't always like the answer, right? That's worth saying. But it always comes to me. And I think this is important to mention, because when we get older and we have families and jobs and all this other stuff that comes into our life, we get really, 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 really bad at remembering to ask us what we need. Yeah. And that's something that's so dangerous. And I love to share this story, Liz, that when, I don't know, this is like 2.5, 3 years ago, and I'm driving home from work, and I literally have this thought comes to me, and it's like, you will never be happy again. That's the thought that came just pouring through me. And what I share with folks now is that the scary thing is I actually became okay with it. I started to be okay with that thought of I'll never be happy. I thought, okay, this is what it's like now. I'm a dad. I got a career. I have bills to pay. I've got, kids that are going to go to college. Like, okay, suck it up, buttercup. This is what real life is now. And somewhere along the way, I had really forgotten to ask myself that question. What do I need? And the moment that I reconnected with myself, really, my life started to feel better, not worse. It started to feel better. And I was able to kind of wake up in a sense and go, you need to do that for you, because that's important. So will you just kind of end on that note of what do I need? And parents who maybe forget to ask themselves the questions and ways where they might start to reconnect with themselves a little bit.
Yeah, and the what do I need can be change. It can be environmental. It can be needing comfort, needing affection. When I stop and ask myself, what do I need in a very similar way, I'm often going back to my inner child. So what does that little girl need? What does that little 5-year-old girl crying in her room need? And she needs to be attended to. She needs affection. She needs a kiss on her forehead and to be told everything's going to be okay. And doing some of even that symbolic work can be really powerful in those moments for you to really imagine whether it's your adult self providing that or somebody safe in your life providing that. But the what do I need, it's sometimes that simple. Like, I just need to feel safe in this moment, and that's how I'm going to do it. And then sometimes it's much bigger and much more profound, and I need to change careers. I need to change partners. And then sometimes in the middle, like, I need to go get a pedicure. I need to go to the movies. I need to go call my best friend.
Yeah.
But stopping to ask the question, that's the most powerful thing.
This has been one of my favorite chats in a long time. I can't thank you enough for being on. Our 45 minutes absolutely flew by today, and I had every intention of having this whole intimacy conversation with you too, that I'm going to just pray that our stars align and we get to bring you back and have that, because it's such a critical piece of the puzzle. Dr. Fedrick is also a professor at GCU, which I learned that about you today. That's kind of fun. And if you want to look her up at evolvecounselingaz.com, you can. I'll put links in the show notes to her Instagram, which I think is a must follow. I really mean that. There's a lot of really bad Instagram accounts out there, and yours isn't one of them. Clearly, you care about what you're putting up. You're thoughtful about what you're putting up, and there are no mistakes in life, right? Like if you come across her feed and there's a post that smashes you across the face, you were probably supposed to see it that day, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, wow. Well, Liz, if I can be an advocate for you or help you out in any way, I hope you'll let me know. And is there anything we've left off the table today with regard to walls versus boundaries that we want to end on or drive home?
No, I think this was a beautiful conversation. I'm very grateful for you to give me this space to do that and to share this information. And yeah, I'm very grateful for you. I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing as well. It's so important and much needed. So thank you so much.
We have 3 goals with Learn from People Who Lived It. 1, to help you feel less alone. 2, encourage you to seek out a coach, a therapist, a church, anyone who can help you get through your journey and find some healing. 3, when you're ready, share your story with us.
Find Learn from People Who Lived It wherever you get podcasts. Search it using all one word. Learn from People Who Lived It.